Jamal Carter had been driving home after a long day at work. He was a young black man in his late 20s, dressed in a simple hoodie and jeans. His car was clean, well-maintained, and perfectly legal. But none of that mattered when flashing red and blue lights appeared in his rearview mirror. Sighing, Jamal signaled and pulled over to the side of the road. He already had a bad feeling. He hadn't been speeding, and he obeyed every traffic rule. Yet here he was, stopped for no reason. He kept his hands on the steering wheel, waiting. A tall, older white officer approached his window. His uniform was neat, and his face was stern. This was Officer Richard Daniels, a man who had worked in law enforcement for over 20 years. Richard looked at Jamal like he had already made up his mind about him. "License and registration," Richard said, his voice flat. Jamal calmly reached for his documents and handed them over. "May I ask why I was pulled over, officer?" Richard smirked. "I'll ask the questions. Step out of the vehicle." Jamal hesitated for a second. He knew his rights. He hadn't done anything wrong. But he also knew arguing wouldn't help. So he sighed and stepped out. Richard's eyes scanned him from head to toe, his expression full of doubt. "You got any weapons? Anything illegal?" "No, sir," Jamal replied, keeping his voice even. Richard didn't believe him. He signaled to his partner, a younger officer, to search the car. Jamal stood there, hands visible, as Richard patted him down roughly. "Where you heading?" Richard asked, as if he didn't believe Jamal had anywhere important to be. "Home, after work," Jamal answered. Richard raised an eyebrow. "Yeah. What kind of work?" Jamal took a slow breath. "I work in corporate management." Richard scoffed. "That's so?" His tone was thick with disbelief. Jamal didn't react. He had seen this before, been through this before. He knew the best thing he could do was stay calm. The younger officer finished searching Jamal's car and gave Richard a small shake of his head. Nothing illegal. The car was clean. There was no reason to hold Jamal any longer. Richard sighed, as if he was disappointed. He handed Jamal back his documents. "You can go," he said carelessly. Jamal took them, his face unreadable. "Was there a reason for this stop?" he asked, keeping his voice polite. Richard smirked. "Just making sure everything's in order. You have a nice night now." Jamal got back into his car. His hands tightened on the steering wheel, but he forced himself to breathe. This wasn't new to him. It wasn't right, but it wasn't new. As he drove away, Richard turned to his partner. "These kids think they own the world," he muttered. He had no idea that the young man he just humiliated was about to change his life forever. The next day, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling of what had happened. He was a man who liked to keep to himself, but something about being humiliated like that had lingered. He had stayed calm during the stop, but the treatment he had received stayed with him. It wasn't the first time, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. But that didn't make it right. Jamal had always worked hard, done everything right, and had kept his head down. He had earned his place in the world. He had worked his way up at a corporate office, and yet people like Officer Richard Daniels seemed to see him as less than. As Jamal walked into his office that morning, he tried to shake off the feeling. But his thoughts kept drifting back to the way Richard had spoken to him, his words sharp, like Jamal was a problem to be fixed. He hadn't asked for much, just a little respect. Later that afternoon, Jamal was leaving work when he spotted a commotion on the sidewalk. A group of teenagers were gathered around, laughing and pointing at something. As he walked closer, he realized the group was looking at a man in a police uniform, Officer Daniels. Richard was standing outside his car, arguing with a store owner. Jamal didn't know what it was about, but he could see how Richard was holding himself, like he was the one in charge, and everyone else was beneath him. Suddenly, the situation escalated. The store owner, frustrated and shaking, raised his voice. "I'm just trying to run my business. Why do you keep treating me like this?" Richard snapped back, his voice sharp. "You better watch your tone, or I'll have you arrested." The group of teenagers around them watched, their laughter quieting as the tension grew. Jamal stood there, unable to move. He had seen this behavior before, the way some people believed they could act without consequences. Richard was no different. He had humiliated Jamal without a second thought, and now he was doing the same to someone else. Jamal's heart raced. He had every reason to walk away, but he couldn't. He had been through so much, and it was clear to him now. Richard didn't just treat people like this because of his job. He treated them like this because he thought he was better. Jamal stepped forward. The store owner was still standing there, visibly upset. "Is everything all right?" Jamal asked, his voice calm but firm. Richard's head snapped toward Jamal, and his eyes narrowed. "What's this?" "You got something to say, kid," Richard snapped. Jamal held his ground. "I think you should stop treating people this way." He didn't raise his voice, but there was something in his words that made Richard pause. The group of teenagers had fallen silent, and Jamal could feel their eyes on him. Richard shook his head. "You have no idea who you're talking to," he said with a smug grin. "Go home before you get yourself into trouble." But Jamal didn't back down. He looked Richard in the eye and said, "I know exactly who I'm talking to, and you should be ashamed of how you treat people." Richard seemed stunned. For a moment, there was a silence. Jamal turned and walked away, but something inside him felt different. He wasn't going to let Richard or anyone else think they could keep treating him, or anyone else, like that. The next few days were difficult for Jamal. The events with Officer Richard Daniels had been a heavy burden on his mind. He kept replaying the moments, wondering if he could have said something different, done something more. But he also knew that sometimes all you could do was keep moving forward. Jamal had always been a man focused on his career. He knew that success came through hard work, persistence, and dedication. He had spent years climbing the ladder at his job, facing challenges from every direction. But now, it seemed like his most difficult challenge wasn't at the office. It was dealing with the ongoing prejudice that people like Richard brought into his life. One morning, Jamal received an email that caught him off guard. It was from his company's corporate office. The subject line read, "Important update regarding management structure." Curious, Jamal opened the email. It was an announcement about a reorganization within the company. The email explained that, due to the company's growth, there would be new positions opening up in the regional management structure, and the company would be promoting individuals from within. Jamal felt a surge of excitement. This was his chance. The email mentioned that the company was looking for someone to oversee an entire region, including several departments and offices. It was a big responsibility, but Jamal had worked hard for this opportunity. He had always been committed to his work, and now it seemed like his efforts were being recognized. He spent the next few days preparing his application. He updated his resume, worked on his presentation, and put in extra hours at the office to demonstrate his commitment. He knew this could be a life-changing opportunity, and he wasn't about to let it slip through his fingers. Finally, the day arrived for the interviews. Jamal was both nervous and excited. He walked into the conference room with confidence, knowing that he was more than qualified for the role. He was prepared to speak about his accomplishments, his leadership skills, and his vision for the company's future. As Jamal was leaving the interview, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He knew he had given it his best shot. But little did he know, this interview would lead him to something even more unexpected. A few days later, Jamal received the phone call that would change everything. He had been selected for the new position of regional director. He couldn't believe it. This was the opportunity he had been waiting for, and now it was finally his. The email had only mentioned a promotion, but Jamal had no idea what lay ahead. What he didn't know was that his new role would bring him face to face with someone he least expected, Officer Richard Daniels. Jamal smiled to himself as he hung up the phone. This was just the beginning. He had worked hard to get to this point, and now he was about to embark on a new journey. What he didn't expect was how life would soon come full circle. Jamal stood in front of the large building, the glass doors reflecting the sunlight as he adjusted his suit. Today was his first day as the new regional director, and everything about it felt surreal. He had worked so hard to get here, and now it was all paying off. As he walked into the building, he couldn't help but feel a wave of excitement. This was his new beginning. The building was modern, with large open spaces and sleek, shiny floors. Jamal had seen it all before in company emails, but walking through it in person made everything feel real. He had prepared himself for his new role. He had already scheduled meetings with different department heads, and his schedule was packed. He was ready to take charge and lead. As he made his way through the building, Jamal noticed a few familiar faces. Some of the staff greeted him warmly, and he smiled back, feeling proud. But as he approached the main office area, he saw someone who made him pause. Standing near the door was Officer Richard Daniels, the same officer who had humiliated him just days ago. He was wearing a uniform, but not the one Jamal had seen him in on the street. This time, Richard was standing next to the receptionist desk, looking uncomfortable in his security officer uniform. Jamal's heart skipped a beat. He couldn't believe his eyes. He had no idea Richard was working here. Richard had always seemed so confident, so sure of himself in his old job. But now, Jamal realized he was just a security officer at the company. Jamal stopped in his tracks, unsure of what to do. The two men locked eyes for a moment. Richard's expression changed as he recognized Jamal. The confident look he had once worn was gone, replaced by something much more uncomfortable. Jamal could see the shift in Richard's demeanor. The tall, tough officer was now standing in front of him as an ordinary employee, with no authority over anyone at all. Jamal couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. He hadn't sought this moment out, but it seemed life had a way of making things come full circle. The officer who had belittled him was now just another face in the crowd, and Jamal was in charge. Richard, trying to hide his surprise, cleared his throat. "I didn't expect to see you here," he said, his voice faltering slightly. Jamal looked at Richard, but didn't say anything right away. He could feel the weight of the moment, but he wasn't going to let it get to him. Instead, he gave a polite smile and extended his hand. "Good to see you again, Officer Daniels." Richard hesitated, then shook his hand, though the discomfort was still clear on his face. "I didn't know you were the new director." Jamal nodded. "Yes, I'm in charge of the region now. It's a big change for me, but I'm excited for it." Richard's face remained neutral, but Jamal could tell that the news wasn't exactly what he had expected. There was no apology, no sign of regret for their past encounter. It seemed that Richard had simply accepted his new position without much thought. Jamal didn't feel the need to make the moment more dramatic. Instead, he simply turned and continued walking, his mind already moving forward. He had bigger things to focus on now than Officer Daniels. But as Jamal walked away, he couldn't help but wonder how things would unfold now. He knew this moment was just the beginning, and the future was full of new opportunities, both for him and for the man who had once tried to make him feel small. To be continued. The next few days at work were a whirlwind for Jamal. As the new regional director, there was much to do. He had meetings to attend, reports to review, and new systems to implement. But no matter how busy he got, his thoughts kept drifting back to Officer Richard Daniels. Each time Jamal entered the building, he saw Richard, always standing at the entrance or sitting at his security desk, watching everyone come and go. Richard had avoided looking Jamal directly in the eye after their brief encounter, but Jamal could feel the tension whenever they crossed paths. It was as if Richard was constantly trying to figure out how to deal with the situation. Jamal, on the other hand, didn't feel the need to say anything. He had no interest in making things difficult for Richard. He was here for a new chapter in his life, and he wasn't going to waste his energy on the past. But he couldn't help but wonder what Richard was thinking. A few days after their initial meeting, Jamal found himself walking to the break room to grab some coffee. As he approached the door, he saw Richard standing there, looking as if he was about to leave. When Richard saw Jamal, there was a long, awkward pause. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The tension in the air was thick, like something was hanging between them, unspoken and unresolved. Jamal took a deep breath, then decided it was time to break the silence. He wasn't here to hold grudges, and he wasn't going to pretend like what had happened didn't matter. "Officer Daniels," Jamal said, his voice calm and even. "We need to talk." Richard looked up, his expression a mix of surprise and uncertainty. He clearly hadn't expected Jamal to approach him like this. He shifted slightly, a little uncomfortable. "Yeah. What about?" Jamal paused for a second before speaking again. "The other day, when you pulled me over, when you treated me like I was a criminal for no reason, I need you to understand that it wasn't right." Richard's face twitched. He looked around as if trying to gather his thoughts. I didn't mean to offend you," he said, his voice softer now. But Jamal could hear the hesitation in his words. "I don't think you intended to offend me," Jamal replied. "But the way you spoke to me, the way you treated me, it hurt. And that's something I don't think you understand." Richard didn't respond right away. He stood there, looking like he was trying to process Jamal's words. The awkward silence returned, only this time it felt different, less charged with anger and more filled with understanding. Jamal gave him a moment before continuing. "I want you to know that I'm not here to make your life harder. I don't want to hold a grudge. But I also need you to see that your actions matter. They have consequences, whether you realize it or not." Richard finally met Jamal's eyes, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something resembling understanding in his gaze. It wasn't much, but it was something. He shifted on his feet and let out a deep breath. "You're right," Richard said quietly. I never looked at it that way. I'm sorry." Jamal nodded. "Thank you for saying that." The two men stood there for a moment longer, neither of them saying anything more. For Jamal, this conversation was a step towards something bigger. He wasn't sure if things would ever fully change, but it felt like a beginning. And sometimes, that's all you really need. As Jamal walked away, he couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. He had faced the past, and now he could finally look forward to the future. The road ahead would be filled with challenges, but Jamal was ready for whatever came next. The days after Jamal and Richard's conversation felt different. The air around them seemed less tense, but things had changed. At least for Richard. Jamal could see the shift in his behavior. The man who had once looked at him with suspicion and arrogance was now avoiding his eyes and walking a little more carefully around the office. It wasn't obvious, but Jamal noticed. Richard's attitude had always been tough, even overbearing at times. But after their talk, there was a quiet change. When Jamal walked through the building, Richard would greet him with a simple "good morning" or "have a good day," and his voice was always respectful. It wasn't warm or friendly, but it was different than before. It was a sign that maybe, just maybe, Richard was trying to be better. Jamal didn't expect an overnight transformation, but he appreciated the effort. He wasn't asking for an apology every day, nor was he expecting Richard to become his best friend. Jamal just wanted to see that Richard could recognize his mistakes and learn from them, and that's what seemed to be happening. One morning, Jamal was walking into the building when he noticed Richard standing by the door. As usual, Richard was wearing his security uniform, but today there was something in his posture that stood out. Instead of his usual tough, guarded stance, Richard stood a little straighter, and when he saw Jamal, he nodded respectfully. Jamal returned the nod, but this time, there was something different about it. It wasn't just the polite exchange between two colleagues. It was the quiet acknowledgement that they had both changed. Over the next few weeks, Richard began to open up more. He stopped hiding behind his tough exterior. There were no more jokes about Jamal's appearance, no more snide comments when Jamal passed by. Richard didn't go out of his way to be friendly, but the defensive wall he had put up seemed to be crumbling. Little by little, Jamal could sense that Richard was learning, not just about him but about himself. He had always been quick to judge, to make assumptions based on what he saw. But as Jamal had pointed out, those assumptions were often wrong. Richard was now taking a step back, learning to pause before making judgments. One afternoon during a company-wide meeting, Jamal stood at the front, addressing the staff. He was confident in his new role, speaking clearly and outlining his plans for the department. As he spoke, he noticed Richard sitting in the back of the room, his eyes focused and his posture more attentive than it had ever been before. It was clear that Richard was respecting Jamal now, not because he had to, but because he saw him as a leader. Later that day, Richard approached Jamal. He didn't make any jokes or try to lighten the mood. Instead, he simply said, "I appreciate the work you're doing. I respect what you're trying to achieve here." Jamal smiled, surprised by the sincerity in Richard's voice. "Thank you," he said. "That means a lot." There was no need for further words. The unspoken understanding between them was enough. Richard had learned that leadership wasn't just about authority. It was about recognizing the worth in others, regardless of their background. For Jamal, this was proof that change was possible. Not just for Richard, but for anyone. It wasn't easy, and it didn't happen quickly. But with time and effort, people could grow. Jamal had seen that firsthand, and he knew that this was just the beginning of something better. A few weeks had passed since Jamal and Richard had their honest conversation. The tension that had once filled the air between them had slowly melted away, replaced by a sense of respect that had been hard-won. But even though things had improved, Jamal knew that Richard still struggled with the weight of what had happened. The things Richard had said and done were not easily forgotten, and Jamal could tell that Richard was still carrying a lot of guilt. One afternoon, Jamal sat in his office, going through some paperwork when he heard a knock on the door. He looked up to see Richard standing in the doorway, hesitating as if he wasn't sure whether to enter. "Hey, Richard, what's up?" Jamal asked, offering a friendly smile. Richard cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable. He had stopped avoiding Jamal in recent weeks, but today there was something different about him. He wasn't wearing his usual confident exterior. I wanted to talk to you," Richard said, shifting on his feet. "I've been meaning to do this for a while, but I didn't know how." Jamal leaned back in his chair, sensing that something important was about to be said. "What's on your mind?" Richard took a deep breath and stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "I've been thinking a lot about our conversation," he began, "and I've been thinking about the way I treated you that day. The way I treated you when I pulled you over. I wasn't right." Jamal remained quiet, his heart beating a little faster. He hadn't expected Richard to bring it up again. After all, the apology had been given, but the sincerity in Richard's voice made Jamal realize that this wasn't just another empty apology, it was something real. "I've had a lot of time to think about it," Richard continued, looking down at his shoes. "And I know now that I was wrong. I shouldn't have treated you that way. I shouldn't have judged you based on the way you looked, or made you feel like you were less than. That wasn't fair, and I am really sorry for that." For a moment, Jamal said nothing. He hadn't expected Richard to come to him like this, and he wasn't sure how to respond. The last thing he wanted was to make Richard feel worse. But he also knew that it was important for him to be honest about his feelings. "Richard," Jamal began, his voice calm and steady, "I've already forgiven you. What happened that day, it's in the past. But I can see that you've been carrying that weight. I know it wasn't easy for you to come here and say this, and I appreciate it." Richard nodded, his eyes filled with emotion. I wanted you to know that I'm not the same person I was that day. I've learned from it, and I'm trying to be better. And if there's anything I can do to make up for it, I want to." Jamal smiled softly. "You don't need to do anything. Just keep being the person I see now. That's enough." There was a long silence between them, but this time, it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that spoke volumes. Richard had done something many people wouldn't. He had acknowledged his mistakes and owned up to them. And that was something Jamal truly respected. "I'll do my best," Richard said quietly. Jamal nodded. "I believe you." As Richard left Jamal's office, Jamal sat back in his chair, thinking about how far they had come. What had started as a painful and uncomfortable experience had transformed into something positive. Both men had grown. And maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of a new understanding between them. The weeks that followed Richard's apology marked a turning point for both men. The change between them was subtle, but it was undeniable. Jamal could see that Richard was no longer the man he had once been. He had stopped carrying around the defensive armor that he had worn so proudly before. And in return, Jamal found himself respecting Richard, not out of obligation, but because he saw him trying to be a better person. At work, things began to change in ways that Jamal hadn't anticipated. Richard no longer acted as though he was in charge of everyone around him. Instead, he carried himself with a quiet professionalism that made him blend into the background. He focused on his role as a security officer and did his job without seeking attention or praise. Jamal couldn't help but notice the shift. It was as if Richard had finally realized that true respect wasn't about authority. It was about the way you treated people. And Jamal could see that Richard was trying to live by that new understanding. One afternoon, as Jamal was walking through the office, he ran into Richard near the elevator. Richard, who had been standing by the door, immediately stepped aside, giving Jamal space to pass. Jamal stopped, surprised by the gesture. "Hey, Richard," Jamal said, giving him a nod of recognition. Richard looked up, his face calm and composed. "Good afternoon, Mr. Carter. I hope you're having a good day." It wasn't anything extraordinary, but there was something in his words that felt different than the usual small talk. It was genuine. Richard wasn't just being polite out of necessity. He had learned to treat Jamal with respect, without the need for titles or power dynamics. Jamal smiled and gave a simple response. "I am, thank you. And how are you?" "Good, sir," Richard replied. "Just doing my job." There was a brief pause, and Jamal could see a flicker of sincerity in Richard's eyes. He could feel the weight of the conversation they had shared not too long ago still lingering between them. It wasn't something that could be erased in a single meeting, but it was clear that Richard was trying to be better. "You know," Jamal said, breaking the silence, "I've noticed the changes, and I just want to say that I appreciate it." Richard's eyes widened for a moment, as if he hadn't expected Jamal to acknowledge the change. "Thank you, sir. I've been trying to learn." Jamal nodded, understanding the effort it took to change. "I can see that, and I respect you for it." Richard's posture straightened a little, a small but meaningful shift. "Thank you," he said again, his voice softer. "That means more than you know." Jamal could see that Richard wasn't just putting on an act. He was genuinely trying to be the person Jamal had hoped he could become. It wasn't an easy thing for anyone to admit their faults and work to change, but Richard had done it, and Jamal admired that. As they parted ways, Jamal felt a sense of calm. Things had come full circle. The man who had once treated him like an outsider was now someone who was learning to treat others with dignity and respect. It was a reminder that change, no matter how difficult, was possible, and it often began with a single step. Jamal knew that the road ahead would still have its challenges, but he was confident in his ability to lead, to make a difference. And with people like Richard, who were willing to learn and grow, the future felt a little brighter. Months passed, and Jamal continued to settle into his new role as the regional director. The responsibilities were large, but with each challenge, Jamal grew more confident. He worked hard every day, making important decisions, leading his team, and pushing the company forward. But it wasn't just the work that made Jamal feel fulfilled. It was the people around him. The relationships he had built, the mutual respect he had earned, and the way his leadership had influenced others were all things he valued deeply. One day, As Jamal was reviewing a report in his office, there was a knock at the door. He looked up to see Richard standing in the doorway, holding a cup of coffee in his hand. Richard had been working as a security officer at the building since the restructuring, and Jamal had come to appreciate his quiet professionalism. The old Richard, the one who had treated Jamal unfairly, was long gone, replaced by someone who respected others and carried himself with dignity. Jamal smiled, gesturing for Richard to come in. "Hey, Richard, what's up?" Richard stepped inside, setting the coffee cup down on the desk. "I hope I'm not disturbing you, sir." "No, not at all. What's on your mind?" Richard hesitated for a moment, as if trying to find the right words. "I just wanted to say, well, I know it's been a while, but I've been thinking a lot about everything that happened. The way I treated you, the way I acted. I just wanted to thank you for not holding it against me, and for giving me a chance to make things right." Jamal nodded, looking up from his papers. "I appreciate you saying that, Richard. Honestly, I didn't expect you to come here and apologize again. I know you've been trying to be better, and that's all I ever really wanted, to see you recognize your mistakes and take responsibility." Richard's face softened, and he looked down at his hands for a moment. It's not easy to admit when you've done something wrong, especially when you've been set in your ways for so long. But I know now that I was wrong about you, about everything. I wasn't treating you like a person. I was treating you like something I didn't understand. Jamal leaned back in his chair, listening closely. "We all make mistakes, Richard. The important part is learning from them. You've done that." Richard nodded, a look of gratitude in his eyes. "I never thought I'd be in a position like this. I used to think people like me didn't need to change. But now I know everyone has room to grow, and that includes me." Jamal smiled, feeling proud of how far Richard had come. "You've earned my respect, Richard. You've shown me that you're willing to change, and that means a lot." Richard's expression brightened. "Thank you, Mr. Carter. I really appreciate that. You're a good man, and I hope you know that I'll always support you in whatever you need." Jamal extended his hand, and Richard shook it firmly. "We're all on the same team now, and I'm glad we're in this together." As Richard left the office, Jamal felt a sense of peace settle over him. The journey that had started with a difficult encounter had led to a place of mutual respect and understanding. It wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about learning from it, growing, and moving forward. For Jamal, this was more than just a personal victory. It was a reminder that no matter the obstacles, no matter the mistakes we make, change is always possible. And sometimes, all it takes is the willingness to listen, to learn, and to try again.